Hello and welcome to another video from Dazatron's Diorama Llama, and in this video I'll be showing you how to make a Chinese main-tin diorama. So this kind of week's tutorial was inspired by a few pickups. One of them, as you can see here, is NECA's Usagi Yojimbo. This is the black and white version and just a really cool figure in of itself. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for kind of samurai, as you'll see in a moment, and that was his little pet dog. Well, not pet dog, kind of acts a bit like a pet dog, but his pet dinosaur, Spot. I also picked up this brilliant figure here. This is Maestro Union's Fury Planet, Blade Master Weng, and as you can see, an amazing action figure, and it is an action figure. It's fully articulated, lots and lots of detail throughout, lots of accessories throughout the kind of the package, multiple heads, weapons, hands, and just an insane amount of detail. And actually, really, I picked this up to go with another figure I'm about to show you in a moment, but although this is by a different company, you can see the detail there is amazing. So really, I suppose the main figure that inspired this was this one here. So this is Sun Wukong by Four Horsemen Studios. I haven't got many Four Horsemen Studios offerings in the past. I've got one of their classics. So this was really my first Four Horsemen figure for a long time. But again, the detail on this is amazing, and I've always been fascinated by the story Journey to the West. I've always liked the Monkey King. I remember growing up watching Monkey Magic, and this is obviously a very different version. But that's what inspired me to kind of create some kind of Chinese mountains, and you'll understand what I mean by that, as you can see on the screen there. If you look at kind of Chinese paintings, ink drawings, woodcuts, there's a specific style to their mountains. They've got more of a curved edge to them, this kind of layered effect. So they look quite different to the usual rock faces that I've made in the past. And if you do want to check out some of my earlier videos, we'll talk about how to make a rock face, then please do check those out. But for this one, I'm trying to create that kind of more rounded kind of effect to give it more of that kind of oriental kind of feel. So without further ado, let's show you how to make this thing. So I'm starting off with quite a large block of styrofoam. As you know, it's always styrofoam that I use. I try and use the same materials throughout my videos, the same equipment, just to show you that if you've got a really limited amount of equipment and a few pieces of styrofoam, you can actually make quite a lot of dioramas just with those kind of few tools. So this one's about 4 inches wide. You can get different kind of thicknesses of styrofoam. This is just an offcut that I had lying around that I wanted to use, and I thought this would be ideal. So you can see I've already made a smaller version there just to kind of test out the technique, and it also gives me a nice example to show you before we start. But this second one I want to be larger so that I can display the two of these kind of rocks or mountains together. So this initial one here is roughly about 5 inches, just over. So it's not too tall, and that would kind of fit with many action figures. Again, this is, I suppose these are more rocks rather than mountains, but I'm going for that kind of feel. So this other styrofoam piece there, as you can see, is much larger, which is what I want, because I want it to be taller. And here's just some of the equipment that you'll need to make this. So we've got a craft knife or a floristry knife. I often use a floristry knife just because you've got that longer blade. You'll also need some files, whether they are small ones or a larger file, it's up to you. Sandpaper as well will be useful, just to kind of, again, just neaten up the edges, and particularly for the base of the rock to get that nice and kind of at level. Styrofoam cutter, so an electric cutter, they're either a handheld or a tabletop, whichever you have. And then there's some other bits of equipment there which I'll talk about a little bit later. Just another thing to think about, again, as I said earlier, you can get styrofoam, different thicknesses, different sizes. If you don't have a large piece like I do, you could use smaller pieces and, well, thinner pieces and glue them together. So you could kind of make it in layers and then attach those together quite easily, just using some PVA or Gorilla Glue as I've used in the past. So you do want a felt tip pen or a Sharpie pen, anytime a kind of, I suppose, marker really. And you just want to kind of rough out this kind of arch shape. You don't want it to be perfect. And then you're going to add these kind of layers, almost kind of like an onion skin. Obviously a different shape to an onion, but just to kind of get that idea of these different kind of layers that you find when you look at these kind of Chinese kind of mountains within the artwork, and I'll show you later. So this will change, you might add more layers, but it just gives you something to start with. Now don't worry about how well you've cut this out, because again, as you start to remove some of the styrofoam, this is going to change quite a lot. And you may even want to kind of not use the whole width of what you've got at hand. You might want to make this smaller. It depends how much space you have really in terms of displaying your completed dioramas. So you do want to start off with a floristry knife. You could do this with an electric foam cutter, and I'll show you that actually a little bit later. But I quite like the carving process. I find it quite calming and quite enjoyable to do. So it really depends on how you want to work. So the first step really is to just kind of carve around the edge, that kind of first line of your first layer. And do that as neatly as you can. Now, my knife actually isn't as sharp as it could be, so already it's kind of made a little bit of damage on the edge there. It's not a big deal, because again, we're going to be sanding this down, fining it down a little bit. But it is just worthwhile kind of taking note of that. And if you do start to see that your knife is kind of pulling or tugging at the styrofoam, that's where it's time to really just give it a bit of a sharpen, just using a regular kind of knife sharpening tool. So just going to get that blade, as I said, a little bit sharper. So it's just going to cut a little more nicely. So I haven't gone down too deep. You want to kind of do that a little bit at a time. And then we're just going to cut from one side towards the cut that we've already made. Yeah, so we've got that kind of cut around the line. So we're just going to cut at an angle, so you kind of create this kind of indent. So again, the nice thing about using that floristry knife, it's got a bit of give, it's got a bit of bend to it, and it just means you can get into some of those kind of places that you need to, or get a better angle on your knife. And because we've just sharpened the knife, you can see it slices through that styrofoam really well. So we're just going to continue to do this around the edge of our initial line, and making sure that we are removing kind of the whole of that top layer. We're just going a little bit deeper here, moving the styrofoam around different angles, and just getting a feel for that carving process. Again, we're not looking for a super neat finish here. Remember, this is a rock face, so all of those textures will actually help create the effect that we need. So this initial indent is not as large as I'd like it to be, so I'd like this kind of initial layer to kind of protrude a little bit more. So I'm just repeating that process. So once that first layer is sticking up a little bit, we can just start to add a little bit of texture to that, because at the moment you've got the initial texture just that comes from the kind of manufacturing process of the styrofoam itself. So I just want to get rid of that, and again just kind of help it to match with the rest of the texture that you're gonna see really throughout the rock face. I'm just taking a really thin layer though, so I'm really pushing down the knife so it's as flat as I can get it really against the styrofoam, just removing, as I said, that top layer. And then it might be the case that you need to remove even more, and you just continue to repeat the process until you're happy with that first layer. So that's now finished. So I'm just going to go back to the Sharpie and just draw in that kind of second kind of arch. Remember, it's not a proper arch. We want it to be more organic, really. I also quite like having it off center, so it's not exactly symmetrical. The asymmetrical finish, I think, adds to the effect a little bit more. And I've just repeated exactly the same process. I've used the knife to cut around the shape, and then removing the layers around it. And so you can see I'm going to do that again, just marking in that initial shape. And again, you know, you won't see this line afterwards, so don't worry about any marks that you make with the pen. All of that will disappear. So just go nice and slow when you're cutting that edge. And again, just carving towards the cut that you've made. But do be careful when you're carving towards the cut, because you don't want to slice in too far, because you'll find it will come loose as you start to kind of file it down a little bit more, and you might take away a bit too much. But already this is starting to give me a bit more of a feel that I'm looking for. And if you notice on this initial kind of, I suppose, maquette that I've made, you can see there's quite an indent there on those kind of bottom layers to the top layers, and I think that looks better. It tends to look a bit flat if you don't kind of remove enough of the styrofoam. So I'm going to move from the floristry knife or the craft knife to the electric handheld cutter, and this is where handhelds come in really handy, because you get a lot more control, but you can't get those really neat cuts. This is just kind of for removing the excess, really, just speeding up that process. Now, if you had a tabletop electric foam cutter, you could simply draw out those shapes that you saw me drawing, those kind of arches, onto some thinner styrofoam, and literally just cut those in. And cut those out one go with the tabletop. That would do that really quickly, and you could just build up then layers of those. So just kind of cut out multiple arches, different sizes, and then literally just kind of stick them on top of each other, a bit like steps. And that would be just, in fact, it'd probably be easier than what I'm doing here. But as I said, I quite like the carving process, so that's why I've chosen to do it this way. And it's nice that you get to, you know, see both methods really, but do what suits you. So I'm just starting to remove a bit more of the styrofoam. I'm trying to get that rough cut. So you can see I'm trying to get those arches in without using the floristry knife at the moment, and that's just kind of sped up the process a bit more. And now I'm going to neaten that up, because it's a little bit too rough, it's a bit too angular. And again, if you look back at those kind of Chinese kind of mountain paintings or woodcuts, they look a lot smoother. So I'm just going back in with the knife and just kind of pulling away those kind of sharper edges and just making it look a little more rounded. And there we have it. So in a short space of time, we've got some nice kind of cuts there. We've got some nice textures going on. on the surface, so it's not kind of completely flat. It's starting to look like how I want it to look. So it's really important at this stage that you just clean up the mess that's on your table. I do advise you to keep all those offcuts. Remember, you can use them for other dioramas that you may wish to make. They're great for things like floor tiles or roof tiles. So if you've got the space, I'd encourage you to kind of keep hold of any of those offcuts. It just means you're using or making the most of the material that you've got. So you can see I've just added a bit more texture down here at the side. So I'm just kind of going in almost like a V shape. So I'm going diagonally one side, diagonally the opposite way, just to kind of create these ridges. And then I'm using a small file just to tidy up those edges a little bit. You can't always see how well you've cut some of these layers until you start using the file, because then the bits that are a little bit loose will just kind of come undone as you start to file those edges down. So it's a nice part of the process, just to kind of neaten up those edges. So I was kind of thinking I still wanted the bottom part of the kind of rock to be a bit more three-dimensional. I wanted to stick out a bit more. So again, just taking a small offcut, I just wanted to kind of cut and shape a smaller kind of rock that would go in front of this one. I'm not too sure whether I'll use this in the end, but it's there if I need it. Remember, nothing goes to waste with this. You can always use these in future dioramas, even if you don't use it in what you're making at the moment. So another really good tip is to use something called felting wool. So I don't know if you've ever seen, felting is quite popular at the moment. People make these kind of models, toys, statues from felting, but I thought it would work really well for kind of making a cloud effect, as you can see from those images. And you just open up the felt. Obviously I'm using white felt here, and it instantly gives you this kind of misty kind of cloud effect. It hides the bottom of the rocks, and it really adds to the atmosphere of the diorama itself. It also ties in nicely to the kind of the Chinese theme, because again, when you look at Chinese paintings, you'll see a lot of mist between the mountains. As I said earlier, Monkey Magic is what I grew up with. That was my take on the whole Journey to the West legend. And Sun Wukong, is it Wukong or Wukong, is known for kind of riding on a cloud. So I think all of that really just adds to the finished idea. So just going back to the piece itself, I'm just taking those files again, and I'm just kind of smoothing down the edges now. So I'm not just kind of removing any loose bits. I'm kind of smoothing the edges a little bit more until I'm happy. And then we move to the painting stage. So as you can see, the sculpting stage doesn't take too long. I'm going for this colour scheme, as you saw there, with the blues, the greens and the oranges. So I'm going to start with a yellow ochre and a burnt sienna. You've seen me use these colours before on earlier pieces, and it just kind of gives you that kind of orange effect, or that kind of I suppose an orangey brown. So I'm starting with the ochre using a large brush. It doesn't have to be a nice brush, whatever you've got at hand, because you're not doing a kind of a neat job with this. You're literally just kind of whacking that paint on, trying to get into all of the kind of creases and the textures. And notice I'm taking a little bit of the burnt sienna and just adding it on top of the yellow ochre, just roughly, and then blending that in. Now I'm not trying to change the whole colour. I'm just adding kind of sections of this kind of more reddish brown. And I just think, again, that kind of creates more texture. It makes it more interesting than just using a flat colour. So just repeating that process. I quite like using the burnt sienna as well as you get to the edge of each layer. and again it just kind of makes those layers stand out. If you haven't got, you know, a good light source, they will still kind of stick out a little bit. It is really important as well that you turn your model from side to side so you can see all the edges. Make sure there's no kind of bits of grey that you've missed. So I'm just repeating the process with the smaller rock face, as you can see, and then just kind of wash off your brushes, because do remember acrylic is plastic. That's essentially what it is. So if you leave it on your brushes, you will ruin them because it will dry solid, and you won't be able to get that paint off, not very easily anyway. So I'm just using some really cheap acrylics here to add my next set of colours. So literally wherever you kind of can pick up paint, not talking about, you know, proper art shops, because you'll pay a bit more for those acrylics, but you kind of your cheap kind of hobby stores, you should be able to pick up some acrylics for under £5 really. So I'm just using a small amount of this kind of leaf green, and I'm just going to start on the tops of each of the kind of the arches or the layers that we've made. Just going to brush back and forth quite quickly, just so it blends in a little bit. I don't want it to, I suppose, to look like it's kind of just stuck on. So I'm just trying to catch the edges. So notice I'm not going back to the wet paint too often. I'm trying to get as much of the paint off my brush as I can. So it's almost a dry brush effect, but not quite. You're not drying your brush as much as you would if you was doing the dry brush technique. So I'm just picking up a bit of the green, and I'm just kind of moving the brush in that kind of arch shape, or that kind of curved shape. Again, just to kind of really highlight those different layers. And then I'm using a smaller brush just to go into some of the details, just so I can catch the kind of tops and the sides. And there we go. And so you can still see the orange coming through, but then the green just starts to kind of make the rock look a bit more aged. And then we just repeat that process for the larger piece. Though, you know, sometimes, you know, people are interested, how do you get that kind of blend? It's actually quite easy. As I said, just using that almost that dry brush technique, just moving the brush quickly from side to side, you find it does blend in quite easily, even without using water. So now I'm moving to it's almost like a teal colour or turquoise, and the cobalt blue. I'm just adding that again on the very tops of each of those arches. And you can see the blue and the orange really pop. Blue and orange, they're complementary colours, so they are opposite each other on the colour wheel. So any colours that are opposite on the colour wheel, they will make each other stand out, and they're called complementaries. But they're not harmonious. So harmonious colours or analogous colours, they are next door to one another on the colour wheel, and they tend to blend together. So you will find that blue and orange, it doesn't really blend that easily, but they do kind of stand out and get, as I said, give that contrast. So just with a smaller brush, I'm just adding a few little kind of lines, just those little extra details. You don't have to do this. I just tried it out till I felt it worked, so I kind of stuck with it. So notice the blue as well, it's just on the edges. So you want quite a small amount of the blue and that kind of turquoise colour. It's really important that you do check the sides of your piece as well, just to add some more of those kind of accents. And then just give your brushes a good clean afterwards. And they look pretty much finished. I'm happy with those. And here they are. in place. You can see the felt kind of cloud works really well. Now, of course, this would normally be on a shelf, but by putting this outside, it just means you can kind of see the diorama with some better lighting, really. You don't have to use both rock faces. You can see that works really nicely. And you could use a multitude of characters with these rock faces. So I hope you've got something from that. It's a really easy make. Please don't be put off. Don't be intimidated by it. Remember, all of my makes are for beginners. They're really there to encourage you to have a go, buy a few materials, and you'll get some really good results in very little time. So if you've enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe. I do appreciate it, and I'd love to hear your comments below. And I'll catch you next time.